If you've lived in Minnesota for long, then you've likely heard or even used the expression, a pretty good guy. The phrase exudes Minnesotan brevity. It sums up all we look for in a human being in just 3 words. Pretty, good, guy. We can thus say, for instance, that William Wallace of Braveheart, pretty good guy. Gandhi, pretty good guy. Great Uncle Wally, pretty good guy. Now it's clear that in Minnesota, calling someone a pretty good guy is a type of serious ethical claim. We are saying that this is the sort of fellow we should look up to and imitate. We're saying that this is the type of person who is living a moral and good life. So what is it about these good guys that makes them so good? What's the secret to their ethical excellence? Is it that they always act according to duty, as Kant would likely say? Or that they always act to maximize pleasure, as Mill would say? Well, maybe they do typically act in this way, but this doesn't seem to capture everything we mean when we call someone a pretty good guy. Indeed, being a good guy seems to do more with the type of person you are than the type of actions you do. Now perhaps Aristotle was a secret Minnesotan, or perhaps his jack-of-all-trades lifestyle simply put him in the mindset of a twins-cheering tundra dweller. But Aristotle seems to have similar intuitions to these. He seems to think much like a Midwesterner when it comes to outlining a good guy. So let's turn to his ethics. If you remember from my last lecture, Aristotle proposed that all good things have 2 common characteristics. All goods are that at which something aims, and all goods are the function of that something. When it comes to humans, Aristotle continued, this is happiness, or flourishing, which means living reasonably in decent conditions for a lifetime. Aristotle calls this type of life the virtuous life. Having thus argued that the good life is the virtuous life, Aristotle must turn to proposing ways of achieving this, such as, after all, the work of ethics. So then, how does one achieve a state of flourishing? How does one become virtuous? Well, says Aristotle, first we must recognize that living virtuously, that flourishing as a human, is a habit. Now don't let the word habit throw you here. You shouldn't be thinking of some Greek guy telling you to brush your teeth every night and stop biting your nails. Rather, by saying that virtuousness is a habit, Aristotle means that one does not naturally happen to be virtuous, that one becomes so through care and cultivation. Think about a flourishing, state award-winning flower. This doesn't just happen. It's the result of vigorous care and cultivation. The same is true of the virtuous, flourishing human. So how does one cultivate oneself so as to flourish, so as to become virtuous? Certainly Miracle-Gro isn't going to work as it would with a flower. No, that's true, says Aristotle, but really becoming virtuous isn't any different from becoming anything else. If, for instance, I want to become a builder, I have to build things. If I want to become a painter, I have to paint things, and so on, and so forth. Similarly, then, if I want to become virtuous and so flourish and attain the good life, I have to do virtuous things. As with many answers, this one only leads to more questions, namely, what are virtuous things? Before we look at Aristotle's answer, remember that virtuous living, for Aristotle at least, simply is living reasonably. And reasonably, in turn, means in accordance with common sense. Therefore, if you'll forgive me for mixing ancient Greek with modern grandma, Aristotle believes that being virtuous is having a head on your shoulders. The virtuous thing to do is simply the sensible thing to do. Typically, Aristotle continues, this sensible thing ends up being the average of 2 extremes. For instance, it is reasonable to be temperate with food and drink because on the one hand, deprivation is bad, and on the other, overindulgence is bad. Similarly, common sense tells us to be assertive, as this is between being aggressive and being passive. All this likely sounds familiar, and indeed this way of thinking about virtuous things, also called the Aristotelian or golden mean, has been a staple of household wisdom for thousands of years. Now, of course, continues Aristotle, like all pieces of household wisdom, this doesn't always hold true. It's not always true that you should never count your chickens before they're hatched. You shouldn't do this, for instance, if you're selling eggs. Similarly, it isn't always true that the virtuous thing is that which is in between 2 extremes. If I have the choice to kill no people or 20 people, it isn't virtuous to kill 10. Killing people is always wrong. This noted, it isn't really a problem for Aristotle that there are exceptions to his basic definition of virtuous things. Remember, for Aristotle, ethics is an imprecise subject and should never be seen as offering more than a general outline of what is good for humans. With this, then, Aristotle has given us a basic idea of how one goes about becoming virtuous, and thus how one goes about cultivating a good, flourishing life. Namely, one does the virtuous thing, or reasonable thing, which typically comes down to that which lies between two extremes. Now that we know how to become virtuous, however, we must ask Aristotle, well, how long must we act according to virtuous things before we become virtuous ourselves? In other words, how can we know when our actions have succeeded in cultivating a virtuous character, when our actions have succeeded in cultivating a good, flourishing life? This question is similar to the apprentice woodworker asking his boss, how will I know when I'm a real woodworker? How many cabinets must I build before I am myself a cabinet builder and have attained the good of my profession? Aristotle answers this question by turning to a familiar concept, namely pleasure. However, as Aristotle talks about pleasure differently than anyone else we have read, it is important for us to understand it by itself before we see how he relates it to virtuous living. Pleasure, Aristotle begins, is clearly desirable, and pain is clearly detestable. However, they have nothing at all to do with ethics. We can see this is so since people take pleasure in both virtues and vices, in things that are good and bad. Even though temperance is good, for instance, it can be painful to go on a diet. Even though murder is bad, serial killers derive pleasure from it. For Aristotle, then, pleasure and pain are to morality as having blue eyes is to the ability to see. There are both blue eyes that can see and blue eyes that can't see, just as there are pleasures that are good and pleasures that are bad. However, continues Aristotle, while pleasure is not directly tied to ethics, it is still very useful to ethical study. Indeed, pleasure can help us determine when someone has become virtuous, when a human is flourishing and living the good life. Namely, a virtuous person is one who not only does virtuous things, but takes pleasure in doing so. To put it differently, a virtuous person is one whose character lines up with and so desires virtuous things. A virtuous person desires to act courageously, assertively, temperately, and so on, and is thus pleased by doing so. By describing the relationship between pleasure and ethics in this way, Aristotle shows how different he is from both Kant and Mill. Mill, if you remember, says that the pleasurable thing is the right thing. Kant, on the other hand, says that in order to be ethically good, we must ignore pain and pleasure and act motivated solely by reason. For Aristotle, as we have seen today, he says something very different. Indeed, Aristotle believes that for a good person, reason and desire line up perfectly. Being virtuous simply means finding the reasonable thing pleasant. Aristotle also differs from Kant and Mill in that Aristotle places ethical value on a person's character rather than a person's action. Indeed, for Mill and Kant, being good means acting in a certain way. For Aristotle, on the other hand, as we have seen, being good involves being a certain way, namely, virtuous. Actions for Aristotle can thus only be good insofar as they are performed by virtuous people. In order to see the difference here, think about truth-telling. Mill and Kant would have to say that a person is good because she tells the truth. Aristotle, on the other hand, would say that telling the truth is good because it is the type of thing virtuous people do. In short, unlike Kant and Mill, Aristotle believes it is a person rather than actions that are capable of being virtuous, and thus good. This, then, is why we refer to Aristotle's brand of ethics as virtue ethics. Indeed, for Aristotle, human goodness is grounded on the virtuous character of the person. To compare Aristotle once more to Kant and Mill, Kant said that the only good is a good will. Mill said that the only good is pleasure, while Aristotle says that the only good is a virtuous character. It is this last type of good, the Aristotelian type, that we seem to be referring to in Minnesota when we call someone a good guy. Of course, this could simply be my own bias, as I admittedly can't help but see Aristotle as a good guy himself.